Okay, we'll get started. So again, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today for our latest innovation series session, Regenerating the Meat Industry. My name is Katie Browning. I am the Events and Marketing Manager here at Blink Innovation, and I'm stepping in for our usual Blink host, Wim de Koning, as your host this morning. Wim is unfortunately not able to join us. So the last innovation event that we had was my first one at the Reins, and although I'm not quite as well practiced as Wim, I'm hoping that you'll support me whilst I get my training wheels on, and before you know it, I'll be taking over from his professorialship and presenting his university lectures too. So we are continuing to navigate the changing levels in COVID, and we're pleased that we're able to bring you these events, whether it's virtually, in person, or a hybrid. And moving forward, hopefully we are able to welcome you back into our workshop space soon. So today we have a really interesting session on the regenerative meat industry, and by the end of the session today, hopefully you'll all have a better understanding of what regenerative meat is and why we should care about it as consumers. With different grocery stores, farmers, food manufacturers and nonprofits in the food sustainability space qualifying what regenerative meat is different and what it is. So how do we as the consumers know what we're really getting? What do farmers need to do to be able to get their product in this way? And how can this producer-led movement mean that farmers, animals, consumers, and the environment alike all benefit from these farming practices? So hopefully our wonderful speakers this morning will be able to shed some light and answer those questions for you today. Just before I start introducing them, I'm just going to make a quick introduction. So I know that there are a few people who have come to our events before, but just for some of the newbies, Blink Innovation is a business unit for Lincoln University. We are an agricultural innovation hub, and a lot of what we do is focused around connecting people. And we can do that by delivering events like today, or we have a co-working space, and we can help facilitate projects. The ultimate goal, I guess, is to encourage people to come together, and that could potentially lead to collaboration, and that could potentially lead to innovation. So that's us in a bit of a nutshell, and thank you again for joining us today. A little bit of housekeeping. So this webinar will be recorded and sent out to you after the event, which means that you can spend time listening rather than just quickly taking all of your notes. There will be a Q&A session once all of our speakers have finished, so please do use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and I can pose those questions on your behalf. And as a default, all participants are muted and all webcams are switched off. If you see anything that you'd like to share on social, please don't forget to mention us, and using those handles. We want to make sure that our events and the ideas that come for them are as far reaching as possible, so please do get social. And that's enough of me speaking. Our first speaker is David Stevens from Ag Research. David has a PhD from North Carolina State University and is a farm systems scientist with Ag Research. Having nearly 40 years of experience in farmer application and the uptake of pasture and forage plants for animal production. Currently, he works in farm systems research at Ag Research at the Invermay campus. David is the author of over 150 papers and publications documenting new science, science of application and farmer uptake, covering all our farmer ruminants and most of our forage species, and has been involved with many sustainable farming fund projects. Thank you for listening to me. David, if you'd like to take over.
All righty, thank you very much for that. Much appreciated. Okay, let me share my screen with you and have a little bit of a chat about regenerating the meat industry, and I will place a science perspective on that, just to try and get our heads around where we're trying to go with regenerative agriculture in New Zealand pastoral systems, and I make that point very, very strongly. If we move on, let's grab a definition, and this is one of the points of contention that we start out with. Okay, regenerative meats describes farmers, meat sourced from farmers practicing regenerative agriculture, with apparently the aims to reverse the effects of climate change by rebuilding organic matter and restoring degraded soil biodiversity. An interesting perspective. This is one out of the US. It's the Well and Good website, 2021. Emily wrote that. Interestingly enough, she said, beyond that broad definition, the term is shrouded in confusion. And that is a little bit of an issue when we are trying to portray a farming system that others would like to be able to describe. And it's a very significant problem when you're trying to generate an appellation around a product if you can't describe it. I thought I'd take us through a little bit of history in the first instance, and in red meat in particular. A lot of the principles that are espoused actually were developed out of Africa by the Savory Institute and out of the US in some of their explorations into that. And mostly what it is rotational grazing principles applied to fragile environments. And that's for New Zealand audience. The only real fragile environment that we have specifically is in the Central Otago and the Mackenzie Basin. They are fragile environments. Most of the rest of New Zealand is a plastic environment, which also responds well to rotational grazing principles. And I'm going to be looking forward to Hamish describing his journey through that process, because interestingly enough, New Zealand led rotational grazing principles for plastic environments through the 60s, 70s and 80s. And so we have explored a lot of this ground, and that has helped develop the systems that we put in place now. There is, however, been some confusion in that process. There's been a whole heap of add-ons, and a lot of them came out of the cropping world. Now we know that continuous cropping degrades soils quite significantly. And there are a lot of old practices, in fact, crop rotations and mixed plantings and all sorts of things, which are now being instituted on cropping farms to help them recover from some of their very long periods of degradation. There's been a few red herrings thrown in, which are potentially not active in the New Zealand space. Things like mycorrhiza in the soil. They operate when soils are very poor in fertility. They don't tend to operate very much when soils are very high in fertility like ours. Multi-species mixtures. I will talk later on a little bit about functional diversity. That's quite a different thing from generically multi-species mixtures. And then we've had a whole heap of confusion between soil chemistry and soil biological activity. And we need to sort some of that out. People have grabbed hold of this as commercial opportunity. That never helps. It seems to muddy the water. And you'll note that everybody's aimed at climate change. Interestingly enough, the Savory Institute, through their ecological outcome verification, quite clearly define it as sustainable means you can continue to do what you did before, whereas what they have been trying to do in that place is to do better than they did before. That always depends on your starting point. All righty, let's move on, shall we? Let's grab another definition. This one comes from Calm the Farm, which is an Auckland University-based grouping of a range of people in this space. And they talk about restoring the quality of our waterways. They talk about sequestering carbon in our soils. They talk about reducing greenhouse gas emissions. They talk about food quality and safety and healthy ecosystems to flourish. Interestingly enough, if you mention that to virtually all of our farmers, they will all agree with that statement. That is where they're trying to go. So there's virtually nothing contentious in that, except maybe increasing carbon sequestration in soils. The point they make is improved profitability is now possible because of improved stewardship of our land and water. I would like to hear Hamish's views on that. because it's an interesting, potentially slight disconnect. However, we must ensure stewardship of our land and water if we want to remain profitable into the future. That is not contentious at all. So we have to recognise New Zealand as a unique environment. We have a very long history of grazing management, and I mentioned a little bit of that work in our environment. And that's really important to understand the bits that work in our environment and how we can manipulate those. We have a deep knowledge of functioning plant communities for grazing, again, built up over the same period. We understand the interplay between legumes and grasses and functional herbs that provide food for animals. We actually have a very good knowledge of that. We have a very significant understanding of soil chemistry. And that, again, has been built over years and years of investigation into that space. We do need to recognise that our pastures are built on forest soils. Very few of our pastures are traditional grasslands. So they have limitations in that. And because they are what we would call improved pastures, brought in from elsewhere, most of our ecosystems are slightly incomplete. Hence, we have problems with Argentine stem weevil taking out ryegrass. We have problems with clover root weevil taking out clovers because the ecosystem isn't complete. And so we bring in potential biocontrol agents, etc., to try and help balance that out. So we need to have that understanding when we try to say, how are we going to make this better? All righty. So just want to move on to some innovative technologies and things that are going on at the moment to try and define what is happening. So one of the things that Nicole Sean and her team at Lincoln University, Lincoln AgResearch Lincoln have been doing is looking at trying to generate indicators of soil health and soil biology, for example. And this is an example from some Ngaitahu developments in North Canterbury, coming from dryland forestry, where their score of the soil was just around about 50%, so well short of the mark of being useful land in long-term productivity, through to irrigated pasture 7 years later, which shows you the value of having animals in those systems, having a grazing animal in those systems, having a managed system that introduces organic matter, make sure that the organic matter quality is high, improves the macroporosity of the soil, increases the earthworms, etc., to end up with a soil which is in much better state and in fact has regenerated from it was under dryland forestry. The interesting thought in the work that Nicole is doing is at this end of the process, she's working with Ngaitahu who have a very strong connection with the land and are trying to do the very best for the land to make sure that it works in the future for them, make sure that it is better in the future for them. At the other end of the process, she's working with Sinlay and Danone, who are very directly wanting to understand how they can convey this message to their consumers. So you've got people at one end of the process wanting to make sure that they understand and protect the soils for themselves and for future generations. And at the other end, to deliver to consumers the expectations that they're looking for. And hopefully Simon will spend a lot more time on that than me. Just some other thoughts. And one of the thinking that comes through is the products that we produce from our systems, and what I again would say are unique. We've just come through, and in this instance, I'm using sheep milk composition as an example, but there are a lot of other examples in meat in particular. Noting that most of the flavour comes from the fat, and most of the variation you find in meat comes from the fat that's in the meat. That's one of the few things that we can actually alter in meat, really. But in this instance, this is an example of some milk composition. New Zealand's sheep milk is unique in the world, and you'll note the red lines on the bottom show quite different on the top short chain fatty acid profiles, and on the bottom, a flavor index. Now, what the consumer makes of this flavor index is entirely up to the consumer. The red line at the bottom says that it will be a very mild, pleasant drink in our terms. If you were drinking sheep milk or making cheese out of this, the top line says that you'll get a very strong flavored. And if you like sheepy flavors, it would be right up your alley. So it depends on what the consumer wants as to how we would construct a diet to deliver that to them. And that's kind of important in that we need to understand what our consumer's doing when we design our science and when we design our diets. And again, I'm sure Simon will talk us through some of that. So other things that are on the horizon that we need to make use of to improve, and go back into our regenerating thing, it's to improve, to show continuous improvement into the future. And it's things like new plant genetics and making sure that we get the genetics that provide the appropriate functions in the diet to deliver the right things in the products that Simon is, well, that Hamish is going to produce and Simon is going to sell for us. That's kind of important. New animal genetics, again, we have, for example, the examples of things like Tamana lamb. We have a few other examples in that space where we know that we can improve the opportunity for the consumer. In the microbiome, we're looking, if again, you're thinking that we're trying to aim at being better in the climate, things like microbiome discoveries will actually drive some of our future greenhouse gas emissions. And we cannot forget that we need to continually modify our management practices. Noting, although we have a long legacy of these practices in the past, we need to continue to modify them for our consumers and for our farmers in the future. So let's just run through a few bits and pieces in terms of adding value, things that farmers can do right now. So how about a practice to improve your resilience of winter farming, for example? And this is in Southland. These pastures were both grazed in exactly the same conditions. The one on the left had 4 times the stocking rate as the one on the right, except they both provided the same amount of feed. All we did was give the animals the opportunity to use 4 times the area on this side and only shift them once every 4 days. And you can see the difference immediately in the state of the soil and the pasture that's left after that. Now, these practices weren't in play 20 years ago. Here's another one from one of my colleagues in the North Island looking at deferred grazing. That means you shut it up in October and then you don't bring it back into the round until March, potentially. This is the recovering pasture afterwards, right? You don't grow any more grass at the time, although there's 1 or 2 indications that you may, but you certainly don't utilize any more grass. But what you do is defer some grass so that you can buffer a summer dry period, and then you bring it back into play a little bit later on, and you rejuvenate that pasture through that process. And that's an opportunity that's sitting there for our if we're adding value to food producers, interestingly enough, I'm going to mention some genetic modification here. We have a high energy ryegrass, high ME ryegrass, which New Zealand has pioneered, which we can't use in New Zealand because of legislation. Just going to say, if you want to make some real change for the future to add value to the people who produce our food, high energy ryegrass also reduces emissions. An opportunity. We have our low sheep emissions genetics, which are about 11% lower in terms of their greenhouse gas emissions. We're already working on that. So again, if you're wanting to save the planet, there are opportunities that are sitting there that can be taken up now. Using plants with tannins. We've been working on tannins for a very long time, and unfortunately, they are very, very complex. There are a lot of different types of tannins in different plants, and they do different things, and we still haven't teased it all out. That is an area, again, plants with tannins do a whole heap of things. From climate change perspective, they lower methane emissions. We can go through a whole heap of other we will go through some other options where tannins have a direct impact on what we do. Like I say, we haven't spent enough time playing in that sandpit just yet. And things like changing the fecal urinary and nitrogen balance, and because of the forages that you feed, are really important in terms of changing nitrous oxide emissions from urine patches. The same can be said with water quality. Interestingly enough, a lot of the fixes or the potential opportunities are very similar. So functional pasture mixtures, and again, a lot of the work that Lincoln University and Pablo Gregorini and his team have been doing, and then some of the work that we've been doing at Ruakura, looking at things like plantain. Dairy NZ has been focused quite strongly on plantain to try and reduce urinary N output, and as I said, reduces nitrous oxide emissions, but also reduces leaching of nitrogen into waterways. So things like adding plantain, you don't need to change the whole mix, you just need to change parts of it. And then balancing diets in situ to do that. So getting the appropriate balance of grass, clover, and some sort of functional herb in there. And then again, the low end genetics that Ambreed, for example, are putting forward are all opportunities to help us to be better than we were before, which is pretty much the aim of the regenerational approach. Product value, for example, again, looking at some of those functional pasture mixtures, and again, including plants with tannins, looking at changes in fatty acid profiles in mussels. And again, I'll bring up Tamana lamb, for example, in terms of creating genetics, but to make the most of that genetics, you also have to have the right functional pasture. And so all of these things add up to adding value. And then just a few thoughts about the future, very quickly. Important that we meld all of our old science with new science, because we have a lot of really, really good lessons in that process. We need to concentrate on some first principles of grazing management, of soil fertility, of meat quality. For example, we know some of the drivers, or we know quite a lot of the drivers of meat quality and of pasture production. And we need to make sure that our farmers concentrate very hard on getting those first principles in place in their management systems. We need to make sure that we re-examine some of the current practices through a new lens. And I showed you the example of 1 day versus 4 day shifting. Everybody thought you had to do 1 day shifting to get through a winter in Southland. Says the work that we've done says that you don't have to do that, and there's a lot of upsides for not doing that. But the only reason that we can do that now is because we've changed our expectation of the system. We no longer run really, really high stocking rates to get very high wool yields. We want to get very high meat yields, and therefore we lower the stocking rate. We concentrate on new body condition, making sure that she's in the right condition to produce lambs in the future. And that gives us the opportunity to reevaluate past practices. And that's really important. And again, it's those signals that keep coming back from our farmers and from our markets that means we need to keep doing that. And I suppose the last point I want to make is that we need to make sure we are looking at the right issues. And that's relatively challenging, to make sure that we sift the chaff from the wheat, so to speak, and make sure that we target that. And as just a little bit of a plug, we actually have a cross-CRI working group right at the moment looking at a transdisciplinary research approach to how we can deliver more in this regenerative agriculture space. So we are trying to make sure that we talk to the right people and investigate the right issues when it comes to spending money to help supporting these guys. So hopefully that's a bit of a whirlwind tour through some of the opportunities and some of the definitions that sit there. Like I say, there's still quite a bit of confusion out there. We are trying to refine that. We are trying to make sure that we get the right technologies in front of our farmers to make sure that they continue to improve. So I will finish with that and pass back. Thank you very much.
Lovely. Thank you very much for that. I think I may have set you a wee bit of a difficult task in asking you to define that, because it's not so easily done, but thank you very much. Really interesting stuff. I will not cause any delay and just hand straight over to our next speaker, Simon Lima. Simon was appointed CEO of Silver Fern Farms in March 2018. He is responsible for leading the company, the delivery of strategy and financial performance, and engaging with customers, staff, farmer suppliers, and shareholders. That's a lot of people. Silver Fern Farms is well positioned to champion New Zealand's natural grass-fed red meat at a time when there is a consumer trend to natural whole foods. Silver Fern Farms has an exceptional brand and is well capitalised and has a talented and passionate group of people working hard to execute their strategy. Simon comes with deep commercial experience in the food, manufacturing and service sectors, both here and in New Zealand, and here in New Zealand and in the several of the key international markets which we operate in. Simon, over to you.
Thank you, Katie. Thank you for those kind words. Let me just share my screen. Are we good to go there, Katie? Not yet, there.
That's it, perfect.
That's it. Yeah, thank you for those words. Really interesting for me, 4 years in the red meat industry, and prior to that, 10 years with Zespri. But when you think of the meat industry in New Zealand, I mean, Silver Fern Farms is 75 years old this year, and we're operating plants which are still, some of them are 120 years old, and down Hamish's part of the country, that certainly is the case. So, you know, we're one of those original pioneering industries for New Zealand, but from a Silver Fern Farms perspective, we almost feel as though we're just at the very start of our journey. We know that we need to be really adapting, transforming, reinventing ourselves if we're going to be successful long term. So it's no longer just a matter of working with a cooperative mindset around getting animals processed and onto boats and off to the markets, and they will then take care of themselves. That is certainly not the way of the world these days. So we feel as though we are at the start of our journey. We feel as though our job is to bring the producer and the consumer as close together as we can and try and eliminate as much of the noise as possible to ensure that those two stakeholders really understand each other well and have a virtuous cycle in terms of the way that they're behaving and creating value, I guess, for each other. I'm going to just take the next 15 odd minutes to talk a little bit about what we have learned in New Zealand in particular. So most of the statistics that I'm going to talk about are relevant to the New Zealand market and New Zealand consumers. New Zealand consumers are probably as discerning and as critical of their food production systems as anyone. But we do see that the same trends apply to varying degrees in the European market and the US market in particular, and they're probably accelerating more and more in places like China. The first slide that I have there, I mean, Silver Fern Farms has had branded products in retail in New Zealand since about 2010. You'll probably recall the retail packs that you see along the bottom of the screen there, that we first introduced a branded proposition, quite different than how consumers had bought generic meat previously. And it started to really respond to what we identified at the time as what we called red meat anxiety. People didn't really understand what it was they were buying, how it had been produced, how they should be cooking it, how they get the best eating experience. And so over time, by taking the best cuts, putting them into formats which was going to allow consumers to really access it and understand how it had been produced and how they should be presenting it at the table, has shifted the way that consumers have thought about their product. They've gone through a process of a greater appreciation for the product, greater understanding as to how the production systems have worked, really how it should be handled, how it has been treated through the production process. Ultimately, that it's not necessarily the center of the plate these days, but it's in a combination of other foods that people are thinking about: meat, smaller portions, the nutritional benefits of meat, and in combination with other foods. But ultimately, today we find ourselves with this view of the conscious consumer who's really thinking much more deeply about their products, where they come from, how they've been produced, what they do for them, and ultimately, spending their hard-earned dollar really, really selectively compared with how they had done in the past. So the journey's been quite quick for us in terms of our understanding of consumers. And again, we're only just at the very start, we believe, in terms of deeply responding to what it is they're looking for. The other thing that is quite clear over that same sort of 10, 12-year timeframe is that the number of branded propositions in New Zealand retail has proliferated. So we are seeing a number of premium brands, people who are very focused on portion size, quality, production systems, brands which are now quite common to us, but 10 years ago there was probably only 2 or 3. Silver Fern Farms is the green line through the middle there, but you can see that the growth of premium branded products in supermarkets has really grown very, very quickly in 10 years. We're also seeing that consumers are, well, 1/3 of New Zealand consumers are wanting to reduce their red meat consumption, and they're wanting to do that for 2 reasons. One is because they are hearing a huge amount about the environmental impacts of meat production and why they should be thinking about other forms of protein. And that relates not only, I really like David's comment that it's not just about climate change, it's much deeper than that. They are thinking about water, they are thinking about farming intensity, they're thinking about the sustainability of these food systems, they're thinking about the social aspects of these food systems as well. So about 1/3 of that 1/3 of consumers who are looking to reduce red meat are doing it for environmental reasons, and about half of them are doing it for health concerns. So not necessarily that red meat's bad for them, but they want to make sure that the production system, the nutritional quality, the quantity that they're eating, all of those things make sense. And so people are eating red meat less frequently, and most people are looking to eat less red meat, and that's that's a trend that we can't avoid. From my perspective, it is an opportunity because they are seeking out greater quality over volume, and they are seeking out opportunities to have a meat eating experience in combination with other foods, which is going to be more meaningful for them. I think our products out of New Zealand have such a significant opportunity, which we're only just starting to harness, because I think we have been guilty for the previous 75 years of throwing big volumes of red meat over our shoulders into the market without really understanding how they fit into this big sea of protein that we exist in. So the sophistication of how consumers are thinking about their products continues to evolve. Convenience is something that this generation is really thinking about. They want to have foods which they can consume really quickly and easily. Gone are the days of the leg of lamb and that you're preparing for the Sunday roast. They're wanting very quick, immediate meals that not only tick the convenience box but also cater to their health requirements. They want to know where the food has come from, so the traceability of those products becomes more and more important. The digitization of our supply chains becomes more and more important. They really identify with New Zealand as a country of provenance. Most New Zealanders are very, very proud of the New Zealand production systems, albeit we're almost our own worst enemies, the way that we talk about New Zealand and the environmental challenges that we have, and amplify the challenges at a global level that New Zealand has, when in reality, much of what we're doing is superior to other food production systems, although we still have progress to make. They're looking for those eating experiences whereby people do come together and enjoy the meal just as we have traditionally, but it's still a really important piece of their thinking. But the one that we keep harking on about is conscious consumption, whereby they really are understanding their food so much more deeply, and that's where we do need to be catering. An example of something that we've done in the last year or a couple of years is we have seen that the burger category is something which has been, we feel, underdone in terms of the quality of products which has been available to consumers through retail. And we launched our Honest Burger range about 18 months ago, 97% red meat content and all natural products. And we've just seen that it really did cater to a consumer demand for a format which is a little bit different, but really a natural product that's ticking the boxes for consumers. And we've seen a 15% growth in 1 year in the burger category, and it's increased our branded performance in retail in New Zealand by 50% in 1 year. So a really significant shift. It's just one example of how changing habits and what people are looking for can really change up what's going on from a business perspective. We're into the next phase of this, and we're about to launch the frozen range, but we're combining it today with also the social aspect of what we're doing. So Meet the Need is a charity which is attempting to alleviate what is a significant problem in New Zealand. A lot of people aren't getting enough to eat. And for a food producer and for a brand like Silver Fern Farms, this is something which is really important to us, because we do live off our New Zealand reputation. And yet if we can't cater to our own community, then our brand will suffer globally. And so Meet the Need, here is just an example whereby consumers are connecting with that problem, farmers are responding to it, we're connecting farmers back to the community, and $1 donation on these products is allowing both the environmental and the social components of what consumers are looking for to come into play. But we just need to keep raising the bar, basically. The consumer expectations will continue to move. And, meat eaters are reducing, meat reducers are increasing, flexitarian, pescatarian, vegetarian, vegan. We've just got a whole raft of market segments, if you like, that we need to be thinking about and catering to. The one conversation which has been really loud has been the climate conversation. And so we do social listening. We use companies which go out there and sort of are measuring what the conversations are around on social media. And it's no surprise, but the climate change conversation is the one which is accelerating the most, and in particular relevant to our sector. It has slowed down a little bit as COVID has overtaken, as you'd expect. However, it's not going anywhere, and this conversation is real. There's a spike that you see there in the third quarter of 2021. That's in relation to groundswell, ironically, and that people started talking more about agriculture and climate based on the farmers sort of making a lot of noise about government regulation. So again, it comes down to that New Zealand debate becomes really loud and amplified, regardless as to what the messaging is or who's making it. So really important that we listen to that and understand it quite deeply. Consumers are also feeling bad about life. They feel as though they're doing the wrong thing, and they're being told all the time that they're eating the wrong products, and there is this guilt fatigue which is kicking in. So our job is to tell our story better, ensure that it has real integrity, and allow people to feel good about eating red meat. Our production systems should encourage them that what they're doing is not necessarily quite as black and white as what they've been hearing and thinking with regards to environmental issues, and that they do want to enjoy red meat, but do it guilt-free. They're also wanting to pay more. So the new generations coming through have got money in their pockets that they're willing to spend on the products that meet their requirements. So, if you think about this generation coming through, we really have to be changing up our messaging and ensuring that we're catering to them, because they are willing to spend for it. And that's the premiumization of what we're doing. What's really interesting when we talk about the regenerative definitions, and David had a couple of them, and I saw that there was one in the preamble, no one really has a clear definition that anyone can agree on. And in the market, we've heard about regenerative agriculture being what consumers want, but not many consumers could actually tell us what that means. They have a whole lot of different ideas as to what it might be around soil health, emissions, farming intensity, sustainability, water quality, biodiversity. None of it's really bundled up into anything quite specific. And for us, a couple of years ago, we looked at that and thought, that's an opportunity, because what we do caters to many of those things, and there's one word which consumers are using without really understanding or measuring it. So the opportunity is quite a significant one for us. And with the climate change debate, with the farming practices evolving, with the soil health being the real focus as to what regenerative farming might be all about, and then this emerging idea of regenerative agriculture responding to all of those things, we took it upon ourselves to set up our own definition of regenerative agriculture and the criteria that we would apply. And so about 18, 12 months ago, we defined 8 principles that we felt catered to what consumers were telling us and how farmers would relate to regenerative agriculture. And so I won't go through them all, but essentially they catered to the various soil disturbance, obviously biodiversity, grazing practices, soil health, animal welfare, community, a big one in here which often gets overlooked, natural resources, and our carbon footprint being only one of 8, back to David's point that it's not just about climate change. So for us, defining those 8 principles and then sort of being able to legitimize them with our producers has been a really important step in terms of framing up what regenerative agriculture can look like, how we can then take it to the market and ensure that it's catering to what consumers are looking for. When you marry up those farming principles with what consumers are looking for, they marry up quite nicely. The triangle in the middle there is really the hierarchy of what consumers are looking for. They're still looking for a good taste experience and a healthy experience. Environment and animal welfare are becoming a more and more important aspect to them, but all of the regenerative principles that we're applying on farm do have an impact on the response that we are able to deliver to consumers. And so those principles are now bundled into a certification process for us, which there we go, the New Zealand Farm Assurance Program, which has been around for a number of years. So we have a means now of turning those principles into something quite meaningful as to how farmers are performing, measuring what they're doing on their farms, introducing 3 new components, which we now call Farm Assurance Plus, which cater to the more the people, the natural resources, biosecurity, more of the sustainability driven practices, which ultimately for us allows us to measure how farmers are performing on the journey. So where are they on the journey? What is the direction of travel? Where are the areas that they need to be placing additional focus? But it's not a binary outcome. It's a combination of different outcomes that they're achieving. And it's probably a journey that we don't necessarily ever arrive at our destination on. We're always progressing. So one of the definitions that I saw in the preamble was that regenerative was organic. We don't see it that way. We think organic is very prescriptive and quite binary in terms of the outcome. We see regenerative as a bundle of different practices which are ultimately achieving better outcomes. And I'm going to just give you one example of how we're turning that into a really closely linked, and this is my last slide, a really closely linked market program, which is changing farming behavior. So the market signals that we are able to capture from consumers are being implemented into a commercial mechanism with technical support and programs for farmers to access greater value, rewarding them for what we consider to be really good farming practices which respond to consumer needs. So we have just in the last few months launched net carbon zero beef into North America. This is something that we feel is going to get really strong uptake. It is whereby we're able to inset sequestration on farmers' own land in a pooled system, whereby we are able to, backed up by Toitu and the US Department of Agriculture, able to validate that the carbon production from these farms for these products is positive, zero or positive. So this is quite a different model than we've seen anywhere else in the world. We believe this is the first of its kind, whereby it's actually coming from actual farmers' farms rather than offsetting elsewhere. And again, it's just an example of a really close consumer producer mechanism that's allowing environmental change to happen, but being rewarded from the market. And again, it is a direct response to a climate change challenge, but ultimately, as David said, biodiversity and broader sustainability will be rewarded by consumers going forward. And it's just a matter of us to find the mechanisms to get there. So I'll stop there, Katie.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Simon. I find that idea of conscious consumerism really interesting, and the way that the industry has to pivot in order to meet those expectations, which is obviously really difficult when the definition is still so unclear. So on to our last speaker, Hamish Bielski. Hamish, his wife Amy, and their 3 children farm in a joint venture on a 300-hectare farm in South Otago between Balcluva and Clinton. It is their 8th year into the venture. The land consists of gentle rolling to steeper gullies that bound the Pomahaka River. Oh, I hope I've said that right, apologies. They have run an integrated sheep, beef and forestry operation for the initial years, but are heading down the path of using regenerative farming principles and have decided to run 2,500 breeding sheep, 200 trading cattle and no more cropping. I'll leave it there and just hand over to you, Hamish, if you'd like to share your screen when you're ready.
Sure thing. I haven't got much time, so I'm going to be blunt and I'm going to probably annoy a few people here, so bear with me. We started out cropping 8 years ago when we started on this farming operation, and we started to get a really good understanding of what's going on in the global perspective. And so we suddenly thought, well, if people are going to start eating less meat, and if meat's bad for the planet, then we better start doing some more cropping. And what this whole movement of veganism, and you name what it is out there, processed sterile meats and cultured crap like that, I started understanding what is going on. What is behind this? Do we need to change? What are we doing wrong? And I felt like a bit like those consumers who suddenly they're feeling guilty about everything. You know, everything that we're doing is bad. How do we rectify this? And so I've probably had in the last 5 or 6 years the most intense education on our ecosystems, our climate, our water, our profitability. Everything is. What I learned at university was just minuscule compared to what I've learned in the last 8 years. And so I just want to quickly share my thoughts on all that. So once I realized, what I'll do, I'll share my screen and I'll show you a video of what is in our context, our biggest fundamental problem.
Wow. That is just flowing off. Flyby soil down the river. Up there.
Okay, hopefully you all saw that. And this is the other slide I want to show just while I'm sharing my screen. So this is from Dr. Paul Mudge on soil carbon in grasslands at around 106 tonne, high production grassland, a little bit lower. And then we have native forest, exotic forest, and then annual cropland at 16 tonne per hectare, lower than pasture land.
Sorry, Hamish, we can still only see the video. We can't see your other screen. Sorry.
Oh, you can't see the other screen. Why is that? Now I'll stop sharing and then I'll share again and see if we can bring that up. Can you see that? Does that come up?
No, nothing just yet.
All right. I wonder why. I don't know why. Anyway, I'll stop sharing. How can I stop sharing? Stop sharing.
Perfect. If you just want to
All
pop
right,
your
I won't
video
worry
back
about
on
that
so
now.
we
I've
can
gone.
see your face.
How do I go to the video now? Oh, yep. There we are.
Perfect.
Okay. So basically I was sharing some data from Dr. Paul Mudge on soil carbon stocks on pastoral farming, which is at 110 tonne per hectare, 106 tonne per hectare versus cropping at negative 16 tonne per hectare. So I started thinking, if I carry on down the cropping path, I'm going to reduce my soil carbon. I'm going to use more fossil fuels per hectare. And so at the time we were using about maybe 150 litres of diesel per hectare. And so we stopped cropping. We started increasing our soil carbon again through pasture and rotational grazing. And we dropped our diesel consumption per hectare to 20 litres per hectare, from 150 to 20. Now, this is reality. This is not some delusional marketing scheme that we're seeing at the moment where meat is bad for you and livestock are destroying our climate. So, let's keep stopping on me. So, I don't know why the bit, oh, there it is. So anyway, what we've done is we've gone purely livestock, because for our ecosystem, it is the best system and operation that we can run for our land and our water and our profitability. What we spend far too much focus on is the climate, in my opinion, and very little focus on our ecosystems. If we deal with our ecosystems and improve our land and stop our sediment running off into our waterways and reduce our amount of bare soil, which oxidizes carbon straight into the atmosphere, and reduce our use on non-sustainable resources, then I think we've got a great future. And that is the path that we have taken. So I think our consumers, if that's what you want to call them, are fed marketing hype and crap, which is not true. And if they actually understood how good it was to eat New Zealand's pastured beef and lamb and milk, they wouldn't be guilty. They'd probably drink and eat more. And so we just seem to, as farmers, as a meat industry, we're so small compared to the big global marketers. We're not marketing processed food. We're marketing natural, real food. And that's what people want. They just don't know it. You know, the latest Beyond Meat or Impossible Burger shares have plummeted in the last few months because suddenly they're realizing that the hype is wearing off and that people just want real food. So we're just focusing completely on not what the consumer wants as such, but what is best for our land and our ecosystem. And the consumer will then be educated over time, because the truth eventually comes out. And we're not worried about methane from our animals, because when we get a wet season, we increase our stocking rate to eat our pasture. And when we have a dry season, we drop our stocking rate. We are always adjusting our stocking rate to meet the biological system and how much grass is naturally growing. We no longer do any winter cropping, and we're all pasture farming. We are going to make the most of the ETS scheme, which we think is completely flawed, but we're going to plant space poplars instead of pine trees in our gullies and tougher country. And so we get credits from that because they get 30% coverage, but we can still run livestock. So it's a win-win. We're not dropping soil carbon by planting pine trees. We're actually going to carry on to increase it, and we add shade and shelter. So after all the educating that we've done in the last 8 years, livestock and well-managed livestock are the absolute solution to our, what I call planet pollution. New Zealand's sheep and beef and dairy is unmatched globally in terms of its sustainability. And now, when we come back to the word sustainability, methane will be irrelevant in a decade, 2 decades time when we start running out of energy. So fossil fuel energy and solar power energy are the complete antithesis of each other. And we are aiming for maximizing solar energy and converting it into high quality, nutritious food. That is basically our whole vision here. We're not complicated. We run a very complex system. And when it comes to marketing our meat, we've seen very clearly in organics, 20 years ago, they said, I think it was, most of New Zealand will be organic. Well, there's less organic farmers, sheep and beef farmers in the south now than there was 20 years ago. In 2007, we were told that there's just going to be such a massive market for organics that we should be going that way. Well, there's less. Most meat companies don't even process organic lamb now. So they're getting a 30 cents per kilo premium over what we're getting at very good returns now. So this whole notion that the consumer is going to demand us to have a methane or whatever greenhouse gas plan is a complete crock. We'll run out of food before they worry about the methane coming off our animals. The methane from our animals is a completely natural cycle. It is our management on our land which has more of a detrimental effect to any outcomes than our animals ever will. Just to put in perspective, in America, they have 3 million open wells spewing methane into the atmosphere every second of every day, year after year. That is a problem. So when I've stopped focusing on these pie in the sky problems and started focusing on our own land and our own management, and our management has changed has been very simple. What David Stevens has said with old science is so very true. We are actually implementing the old science far better. How a pasture grows has not changed since they evolved with natural animals. And how we manage that is just what I learned from Lincoln, what I've learned from the likes of David Stevens, has not changed, and we're just doing that better. Basically, to sum it up, what we've done different is we have reduced our mobs. Say we've gone from 10 mobs to 2 mobs over the whole farm, and we just extend our rotations when needed, when we have slower pasture growth, and we speed up our pasture around when we have more growth. It's really, really simple. At the moment, we are really, really dry. I'd say we're drought, and we are now having to graze off some of our ewe hoggets as a strategy to lower our stocking rate per hectare. And they'll come back on when we're back in the position to do so. So we're flexible. We're trying to keep it a very simple operation in a very complex system. At the moment, we just have the same system that has got us in trouble. We're using the same accounting system to try and get us out of trouble, which is know your greenhouse gas number on your farm. I refuse to do it. The methane from our animals' impact happened decades ago. When we use proper science with GWP star, we're not causing any more warming. In fact, we're cooling since 2008 as an industry. And I challenge anybody to try and find a more sustainable, scalable farming food system than New Zealand's dairy, sheep and beef. There is no other. And when we talk about sustainable, I talk about using very low non-renewable resources. Our aim is to use none, but that's going to take a while. That's more ideology or a nice thing to be able to do in the future. But if we're talking about fossil fuels versus solar energy, there's no better and more sustainable system than in New Zealand. And that's pretty much what I want to say. If I run out of time, yep.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Hamish, and to all of our speakers. I think it is a really interesting topic. So I'm going to open up the Q&A now to encourage everyone to submit their questions. If you want to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, you can do so under your name, or you can post it anonymously. I'll put forward the questions to each of the speakers if it says their name. And if you just want to pop it down, even if you have to leave the webinar early, we'll get through all of the questions, we'll record it, and we'll send it out afterwards. So I'll just give a little bit more time for some people to pop some questions through. I think if you do have that one for a specific speaker, then pop their name on it. And if you have a more broader question, just leave that open. I'll pose it to everyone, and the speakers can kind of fight it out between themselves of who gets to answer first, or perhaps elaborate a bit further if they have something to add. So the first one has come through, and I think this one actually could have been more directed to David as it came through when you were speaking. Someone's asking if you could explain plastic environments.
Plastic versus fragile environments. Yes, indeed. The simplest explanation is the amount of rainfall they get. That's really simple. So if you're in Africa, in the savannas, and you get 300 mils of rainfall in 3 events, that becomes a very fragile environment. And what the fragility in that is, it's not just about how much feed is produced for the animals that are in that environment. It's about the fluctuations in potential soil carbon, for example, and their vulnerability to overgrazing in particular, right? So with New Zealand, with relatively high rainfalls, relatively consistent rainfalls, not that our farmers would tell you that, they'll always complain about the weather. However, it is much, much more consistent than a lot of other environments. So the environment that Hamish is living in is one of the 3 environments around the world which are most appropriate for pastoral agriculture. There's a little spot in Chile, and there's another spot in Northern California that are the same as or similar environments that are the robust or plastic environments, really plastic environments, which can be utilized really, really effectively with ruminant agriculture. Yeah, so hopefully that helps.
Fantastic. Thank you for that answer, David. Just waiting for a few more questions to filter through. Please don't be shy, pop in your questions and we'll get some answers for you. If anyone has anything that they want to propose. Maybe I'll fill in and I can ask a couple of questions. So I was just wondering if anyone has found it surprising how the shift has been in the consumption of meat in the past few years. Does that surprise anyone? Did you see it coming?
I can go first if you like. I'm sure Simon's got a bit more insight than me, but generally probably not a surprise. However, it's only in very westernized cultures that this is an issue.
That's right.
So the overall consumption of meat around the world, you've arrived in the middle classes if you can afford meat, right? That's the deal. So the overall consumption continues to go up. It's as we have recognized that maybe we're eating a little bit too much, and that's a fair call. Anyway, Simon.
David, you've done pretty well. I mean, the global demand is going to continue to increase. The thing is, and Hamish touched on it beautifully, people around the world haven't appreciated how our production systems and the quality of our products are produced, and we have done as marketers a poor job of telling our story. So the opportunity for us is to really focus on those segments that are looking for what it is that we do, and they exist in big numbers, and they exist with a lot of disposable income. So for me, this is an opportunity, the challenge of plant-based proteins, of lab-based proteins, all of that has just made the conversation more relevant to what it is that we do. So I embrace it. I think it's a good thing that we're now thinking and talking in these terms, rather than that sea of red meat, most of which is industrially produced on feedlots. And we are 1% of the world's red meat out of New Zealand. It's a drop in the ocean, but it's the best 1% that the world can produce. We need to make sure that we can validate that, we can put real integrity around it and tell the story really, really well. There are some areas that we still need to tidy up, but telling our story and accessing the 1% of consumers that really, really get it and really, really want it is the challenge. But we have an extremely viable long-term future, in my view. Most of the challenge that we have is domestic, and it's around policy settings and around our commitment to global climate change, global emissions targets and what have you, which is driving a slightly perverse debate in terms of how we're thinking about farming and the environment and what have you. But the meat consumption probably going down, as we've discussed, but you can't think of it in just those broad terms. You've got to really break it down into different segments.
Lovely. Thank you very much for your answers there. We've filled in some time, and there's quite a few questions come through, so I'll kick off at the top. This one is for you, Simon. What practical ways do you influence farmers to produce to meet consumer trends, and what is farmer or shareholder sentiment at present?
Yeah, that's a really interesting one, and I apologise to those people who've heard me say this before, but I say it quite a lot. We had a saying in the kiwi fruit industry, which was "do as I pay, not as I say." And I think, the commercial reality of farmers having to run businesses and wanting really clear commercial signals as to what's going to make them better off, and combining it with technology and farming practices and essentially knowledge is the key to it from my perspective. So what's really exciting about the situation we find ourselves in at the moment is that what we're trying to do on farm, or progressive farmers like Hamish are trying to do, absolutely marries up with what consumers want from us. So we've got a perfect situation whereby consumers are asking for what it is that we do, and farmers are moving more and more progressively to models that deliver on that. So our job, just as we're trying to do with net carbon zero beef, is to put commercial mechanisms in place that will reward them. The market will reward them, rather than regulation beating them up for not doing it. That's a much better situation for us to be in, because there is commercial value in what we do. So from a Silver Fern Farms perspective, it's absolutely about implementing market-led mechanisms which are going to change behaviour. We're having quite a strong conversation, I think, with the government at the moment around there are possibilities for us to do that. The last thing we want to do is put in place blanket regulation such as the ETS, and really marry up a whole range of things which are going to shift the way that we're behaving in New Zealand, but link it up to what's going on in the market, because ultimately that's the only place we will win long-term commercially, is in the market. So that was the first half of the question. I think the second half was how are farmers feeling about it. I think those progressive farmers like Hamish, you can hear the optimism in his voice and the belief. And so we talk to a lot of farmers who are feeling that way. There are others out there who are feeling a little bit beaten up, and it's a matter of trying to connect the dots between where they are today and where they probably should be aspiring to. But again, finding commercial mechanisms and technologies and farming systems which are going to help them to join those dots on that journey. I think farmers are feeling pretty good. I mean, commercially, the global market for our product is pretty good, so there are good returns out there. There's a bit of cash in the system which will allow us to make change as well. So it's a great time to make progress.
Lovely, thank you. The next question is for Hamish. How do you think our red meat advertisers, companies and farmers could work together better to communicate the real status of the red meat industry in New Zealand?
I actually think they're doing a good job now. For a long time, everyone has been capital strapped. No one's had any money. Farmers don't have any money. Meat companies don't have any money. So how do we expect them? Beef and lamb doesn't have any money. So compared to big corporates that have billions of dollars of backing behind them, they have the marketing power. I think the most classic example for me is we all say that consumers decide. So when they put out synthetic carpets, all the retailers said, well, synthetic carpets are the way to go, wool carpets no good. So the consumers don't know any difference. They just get told, and then they go, oh, well, we'll buy it. And then they say, well, the consumer demands it. The consumer doesn't demand it. The consumer thinks that's what it should be. So now that they're coming out with woolen carpets, and now they're saying how good they are, the customer's like, oh, well, these must be good. So as far as up against some of those big corporates, we're on hiding to nothing, but they're doing a really good job now, as good as what I think they can do at the moment. Mate, we can always do better. Let me tell you one thing. I listened to the Joe Rogan podcast, and he was interviewing Dr. Jordan Peterson. And on that show, Dr. Jordan Peterson praised lamb, praised grass-fed lamb. They probably did more marketing than what New Zealand's ever done in its last 2 decades. You know, it's starting to come through some of these. I think it'll slowly happen. The truth slowly comes out, and the more that comes out, the more people search it, the more people want to learn, the more people educate themselves. So it swings and roundabouts, and I don't think we need to. I think we're doing a pretty good job.
Fantastic, thank you. This is another one for Simon. You said that the consumer has more money to spend and willingness to spend on products evidencing quality and sustainability efforts, etc. What about the fact that at least 20% of New Zealanders are living in homes that are deemed food insecure and struggle to afford or access the quality nutrient-dense foods such as New Zealand's red meat? Outside of Meet the Need, which is a great initiative, what does SFF see as its role in trying to ensure the affordability of New Zealand red meat by all New Zealanders? Being able to buy your own food is mana enhancing. Relying on food banking model is not. That's a bit of a tough one.
No, it's a really important question, and I think brand New Zealand, as you know, as the premium food producer for the world, if we aren't able to nutritionally feed our own people, our own communities at affordable prices, then we have got a brand problem right from the outset. So the Silver Fern Farms brand, the New Zealand Inc. brand, the Fonterra brand, whoever it is that we're out there, you know, trying to position the premium end of the market with a sustainability story, which is, you know, we're trying to shout loudly. If we can't address that problem, then I think we are, you know, it's almost futile to tell the story. So I don't know what the solution is. It is a very live conversation. A lot of the circles that there's an initiative called Mana Kai, which is essentially how does New Zealand resolve this. It's not necessarily one that the farmers should carry the burden for. I mean, everyone has their commercial interests as well as their altruistic kind of beliefs, but it is a community issue that we need to resolve. I think from our perspective, initiatives like Meet the Need are good, but it's you know, it's the tip of the iceberg, but it does bring the problem to a more public sort of debate. We've got a more immediate problem in Silver Fern Farms. We employ 7,000 people across 14 plants across the country. And a lot of those people, the demographics are that they're probably falling into that 20% in many cases. So our most immediate responsibility is to our people. And it's about creating a career path and breaking the cycle of inequity that does exist in our supply chain. And it's not just about food and nutrition, it's also around education and financial literacy and actually building a stronger pathway. I think that goes hand in hand with the labour issue that we have at the moment in New Zealand as well. There's a lot of social disconnect through our supply chain that we have to address close to home, as well as thinking about what the New Zealand Inc. response should be. So I don't have a really easy answer to that, but it's going to be a collective one that we're all going to have to lean into together, I think.
Lovely, thank you. This one is a bit more open. It's not directed to one person. Regenerative farming is supposedly more farmer focused than consumer focused like other farming styles. Do you feel farmers have begun to feel this power shift in supply chains? Does anyone want to take a stab at that one?
I'll quickly, I'll probably just repeat what I said. When I started off, I was very consumer focused and was listening hard to what was coming at us. But in the meantime, if we're not building our soil and improving our water and our profitability, we're not sustainable. So it's irrelevant in the end. So I think the more understanding and appreciation for the farmer, the better we're all going to be. Like, it comes back to, I've always been uncomfortable with organics because the customer has to pay a premium. And I'm like, well, the customer who we want to have our good food are the ones that can't afford it. So it comes back to that last question. The higher our energy price is, the higher the price of our food, the more it hits our poorer people. The whole climate carbon zero agenda ends up hitting the poor people. It's just a slam dunk. And so I'm not after some exorbitant premium, because I know that people who need it can't get it, but I'm after being well rewarded. And also the people that want us to invest more into our environment and improve it then complain that the prices are too high. There's so much irony out there, and it really does frustrate us as farmers. And then our own government wants to put on, say, he waka eka noa, which is more tax, which achieves no more. There's no great outcome, except it costs us more. So therefore the price of meat will have to go up, and therefore our poor people suffer. It's a vicious cycle that no one has really put any thought in. We call it holistic management on our farm. Holistic management should be also done by every single household and governmental and company.
Oh, sorry, David, you go.
I was just going to say, just reflecting on Hamish's commentary there, the question was, do you feel farmers have begun to feel this power shift in supply chains? The answer is no, really simply. Supply chains are extremely complex. They're extremely complex. So to think that creating a title like regenerative farming, which doesn't have a particularly good definition and is relatively hard to prove, will shift the power is not going to happen in the short term. I want to pick up on Hamish's comments about organic farming as well, and I will give you the example of Sri Lanka. There were some policy changes in Sri Lanka which made all of the farmers go organic farming. It caused a total collapse of their production system. They now import most of their food because they cannot meet their own supply. Their farmers are now supported by the government because they can't feed their own families. We have to be extremely circumspect when we start making policy which influences the farmers' ability to do what they're good at. Simon.
Thanks, David. Look, I'd just make the comment that we have to be consumer-led, I believe. The market pays us, and farmers understanding that and responding to that is the key to being successful long-term. I feel as though the power shift in the supply chain has been far too long driven by volume and not quality. And that has almost led to the downfall of the New Zealand meat industry. That is why we haven't positioned our products well in the previous decades, that we've just thought that we can be an efficient volume producer of red meat without focusing on the quality aspect, and the consumer will tell us whether we are producing the right quality or not. So, and I also believe that regenerative farming is coming from the market, as the consumers are telling us that they just don't really know what it means. So that's the opportunity for us to shape it.
Okay, great, thank you. We don't have too much longer left, so we've got a number of questions to get through. Does the New Zealand meat industry struggle to distinguish itself from the big dairy, which is more bulk product rather than targeting conscientious consumers?
Probably for me, I think, in the first instance. I don't see us, we need to premiumize what it is that we do, and we need to get away from, commodity play. Commodity play means that we fall into a bundle of, a big sea of globally produced products, and we've already, I think, agreed today that our products are different and should be premiumized. So I think dairy is different. There is a commoditization to what we do, and there is a global market that they trade into rather than market into. So whilst I would say that we've been guilty of acting that way, we have to really start premiumizing what we're doing, and that does come down to targeting conscientious or conscious consumers.
Okay, great, thank you. The next one is animal welfare important to consumers?
Absolutely, absolutely. And what we're seeing that through our production systems, once again, it's just the natural, untouched life that our production system affords livestock versus what goes on in the rest of the world. So it's one of the 8 principles that we are framing up, and it's certainly something that we hear a lot about.
Just a very quick addition to that. All of the surveys that have done say that it's important in every market that we market to. And so we need to make sure that we adhere to the best possible standards that we can.
Thank you. Fantastic to hear Hamish's straightforward approach. I think we have an opportunity to have farmers like Hamish connect more closely with consumers with telling their story. Any comments? It's a very open one.
Probably one for me. Simple answer: yes, please, Hamish. Let's go and tell the story. I've been to Hamish's place. He's told me his story. He's pretty compelling.
Simple answer from me: somebody's going to need to put a manager on Hamish's place for the amount of time that he's going to be away telling his story.
Fantastic, thank you. So the next one is, having engaged with much excellent material on regenerative agriculture, such as this webinar, I note a very different message depending on the expertise of the panelists, which is a bit discombobulating. Based on that idea that there is relevant information in each of these areas of expertise, how can we come together to draw upon all of the expertise for an even better stitched up food system? Does anyone have anything to say to that?
Could I have a first go at that? Because I think it's a very, very good question. Yes, and I agree entirely with the sentiment that it is really quite disturbing to the general population when we get into this with some detail. And you may have heard, there's some commentary from some of our more traditional scientists that basically their commentary is you're throwing the baby out with the bathwater, and we already know a lot of this stuff. As Hamish has already said, we know a lot of how to do this in our environment, and we just need to improve on it. We need to add in some new technologies. We need to re-examine some old practices. So it's not that everybody's telling a different story, they're just telling the same story from a slightly different lens. And we need to try and get some clarity around that. Like I say, we have a cross CRI grouping, which is trying to work on creating that clarity. And people like Paul Mudge that Hamish mentioned are on that grouping. So, and Gwen Grellett and others. So we are trying to get to a point where we can provide that sort of clarity. And sorry, we can't do it yet.
I'd just add really, really quickly, I think a couple of years ago, I went up with a group of New Zealand businesses up to Wageningen in the Netherlands, and they talk about the triple helix up there, whereby in fact, it's almost a quadruple helix, but you have business, you have government, you have science, and you have community, but all sitting around the same table to determine what is the best pathway forward and how they're going to solve some of the issues that we're talking about here. New Zealand's still disconnected in terms of how we're too small to replicate and not focus. So bringing everyone together, and that comes right through the industrial supply chain, but in terms of how science and policy will interact with our practices and our future success.
And just to add, ecosystems are so complex and supply systems are so complex. And this is why organic has struggled. I'll come back to that again, because the meat companies have got a system that when organics comes and fills in a Monday afternoon or a Monday, everything has to be reconfigured. Slows, it costs them. So I'm sort of come to the conclusion now that if the meat companies do their job well, the researchers do their job well, the farmers do their job well, what will end up happening is you'll get this flow-on effect without trying to complicate too many things and interfere with others in too big a way. So now Silver Fern Farm have now developing a program in a around the regenerative brand, whatever it is. And so if I like that, I'll join. But I can't put all my lambs through that, because at times I'm selling store lambs, like, you know, someone else will finish them because we're getting tight on feed, but I don't want to have to commit all my lambs to one market and have to supply that, because it actually affects our land and our soils and our pastures and our water. So I think we have to be far more, the direction is way more important for each business than trying to get everybody on the same page. That will happen with good outcomes.
Fantastic. Thank you for that. I think we might just end it there on that note. Really appreciate all of your time today. We couldn't put together these events without you very kindly dedicating and donating your time to put together these things and talk about these interesting topics. So I'm really, really grateful. Just before we end, I do just want to just give a little plug to some of the other events that we have coming up. The next one is next week. There are only a couple of spaces left, our activator sessions. So these are one-on-one appointment with a business growth advisor, Jason McRae from Canterbury Employers Chamber of Commerce. Entrepreneurs with businesses at all stages and sizes talk through their business and get focused feedback. It is a really great opportunity if you are starting up a business, if you have a business and you're looking to pivot, a really good chance to just kind of sound out some ideas. The next Vibe event we have is another virtual one before the long Easter weekend on Thursday, the 14th of April. We're joined by Vic Crone from Callaghan Innovation. So we'll hear about the latest projects that Callaghan have been a part of and how they see innovation changing the future of agriculture. And then the next innovation series is on the 21st of April on using design thinking to multiply the impact of agri-science. So we're joined by practitioners of the method as they give examples of successful projects that they've delivered and how they believe design thinking can be used to multiply the impact of agri-science on environmental sustainability. So make sure you keep an eye out on our website for the rest of the events that we have scheduled for the year. We do keep it updated with new projects on our website, so you can sign up for our monthly newsletter where we'll also promote the other interesting events and other events happening in the ecosystem that you might be interested in. And I'll finish up with just two more events that we're partnering on. So the 2022 Food, Fibre and Agritech Supernode Challenge, that one's powered by Christchurch NZ, KiwiNet and Ag Research and the Canterbury Mayoral Forum. So this one is a competition which has up to $70,000 in prizes available. Applications I think actually might have closed now, but please do keep your eye out on our website, because we will be putting on the event to showcase the shortlisted finalists. So that one's a good one to look out for. And the last one is eTipu 2022 Boma Agri Summit. It's a 2-day event designed for people from across the food and fibre sector, and tackles the major questions around how we can be more innovative, collaborative, sustainable and profitable. So make sure you get your tickets for that too. Thank you again for joining us today. We hope you all enjoyed it, and thank you for our speakers for taking part. We will be sending a feedback email which will also contain the link for this recorded session, and if there's anything else you might want to see from Blink, or if we can help you with your next project, please do keep in touch. That's it. Thank you very much.
Nice to see you, Dave, Simon. Thanks, Katie.
Thank you.